Why? 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 That's a question that many people ask throughout their life as they continue on their journey through life. As little children, when the question is asked, it's because they're beginning to notice that there are connections between things in the world, and sometimes there's a cause and effect kind of relationship, and so they struggle to figure out why. Why are things this way instead of that way? The most common question, why is the sky blue? There are answers to questions like that. And while sometimes our patience as parents and grandparents may grow slim, the questions are worthwhile and important. But when we grow older and we become adults and we continue our journey through life, many times there are experiences that we have that cause us to ask why. But those usually are not out of curiosity, but out of frustration or coming from a heart that is deeply wounded. Why? Why did this happen? Why am I going through this? Why is my loved one experiencing this? Maybe someone we love has a condition and is diagnosed as cancer. Or maybe someone who's worked long and hard at a particular job and been very successful all of a sudden finds out he's being fired. Or maybe someone else has a child who is playing out in the street and a car comes along and hits the child. And the child winds up in the emergency room. Or maybe someone loses a loved one who's very close to them, who they very much depend upon and who they really care about. Why? Why? We ask that question over and over again throughout our lives. And often we find ourselves asking the question when we see things happening in the world around us, things over which we have no control. And so we hear about a tsunami coming and wiping out a whole countryside on the day after Christmas. Or we hear about an earthquake and the destruction that it brings. Or maybe we hear about people in Africa suffering from AIDS. Men, women, children. Or for those of us who live here in New York, maybe we remember 9/11. And we think about that question. Why? The question is not so much a question that we want an answer to in a clinical sense or an academic sense. It's not an academic question. It's more of an emotional question and a theological question. We're asking the question of God. We're asking God, why? Why do you permit these things to happen? Why are people suffering? Why is there so much wrong with the world? Why am I so conflicted? And all the rest. There's no end to the number of questions that we may find ourselves asking as we go through life. And it's important that we ask the questions because they are often exactly where we are as we go through in our lives. And we need to be in touch with what's happening with us and with those around us. Jesus is on a journey toward Jerusalem. And as he continues that journey to Jerusalem, knowing full well what was going to happen to him there, how he was going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies, how he's going to be arrested and put on trial, how there's going to be false witnesses brought up against him, and he's going to be condemned to death. And then he's going to be brutally beaten, and then ultimately crucified. We ask the question, why? Why did he do that? Why did that have to happen? Why did God allow himself to experience such pain and suffering? Those questions are not easy to answer. As Jesus is journeying towards Jerusalem, people come up to him and they interact with him. And in the gospel lesson today, we hear they ask him a question about something that they probably are very much aware of, especially at the time of the Passover. They ask about people who were in the temple in Jerusalem bringing their sacrifices. They'd come from Galilee for the Passover, and for some reason, maybe they were stubborn or rebellious or whatever, Pontius Pilate used that as a pretext for slaughtering a lot of them. And so their blood was mingled with the blood of the sacrifices that they brought. Why did God allow that to happen? They asked Jesus. And Jesus said, I have another question for you. Why did the Tower of Siloam fall down on people? And 18 people, innocent people, were killed. Why did that happen? You see, Jesus doesn't try to answer the question in any ordinary sense of answering the question, because there are some things in life for which we really don't have an explanation. And when sometimes you can't explain the things that happen, they are so incredible that we have trouble even believing our own explanation. But Jesus doesn't try to answer the question. Jesus instead says to the people, well, take care of what you're doing right now, because if you don't, you too will perish as they did. Pay attention to who you are and where you are and what you're doing, because now is important in the kingdom of God. That's an important insight of Jesus. But Jesus understood that in the real world in which we live, bad things happen to good people. We don't like it that way. We certainly don't want it that way. But that's the way life actually is. Bad things happen to good people. Good people do suffer, sometimes severely, often unjustly. The real question that Jesus asks is, in light of that, in a world like that, what will you do with the life you have? What are you going to do now? What are you going to do next? How are you going to respond to these things that happen in your life or in the world around us? What are you going to do yourself about these things? You see, that's a very personal question, and yet it's a very important question, because we have a tendency to blame God when things don't go right, or to blame other people when we can find someone that we can blame, or simply to put off doing anything at all about something that we really need to address. And so we put things off, and we don't pay attention, and we let that gift of now escape from us, and we fritter life away. The gift of now, that's what God gives to us. What are you going to do with the now God gives you today? We can't change the past, and we can't really control the future. What we do have, though, is now. And we have the promise of God to be with us here and now, in this life, to bless us and to strengthen us, to empower us, to forgive us, to lift us up, and to send us forth as His servants, as His people, loving and caring and blessing others for the sake of the kingdom of God. What are you doing now with this gift that God has given to you? Some of the pastors were together the other day, and we were talking about this Bible passage, and we raised the question of how we put things off. And somebody said, well, he said, I wanted to join the Procrastinators Club. So I went to the meeting and found out it had been postponed. But that's nothing really to laugh about, because that's what people do with their lives. We postpone the life that God has given to us to another time, another day, another place, another experience, another relationship, rather than making the most of what we have right now. God has given us tremendous gifts and resources and abilities, and the question is, are we going to use them as God intended us to use them? That's the critical question. I think of young people who are thinking about the future. We do confirmation essays every year, and very often the question, one of the questions I ask is, what are you going to do in the future? You know, what are you looking forward to doing with your life? And inevitably, half the people come back to me and say, I want to make a lot of money. And I say, what are you going to do to make a lot of money? And, I don't know. I'm just going to make a lot of money. Maybe I'll be a doctor. Maybe I'll be a lawyer. I don't know. I'm just going to make a lot of money. Well, that's not what life is really about. They're not really thinking about who they are and where they are and who they are in relationship to and what God expects of them. And so they miss out on the opportunity, and often they'll make decisions which will lead them far away from the will of God. And then there are people who are in their middle ages who, as they go through life, have accumulated some resources for themselves. Maybe they have savings. Maybe they even have investments. Maybe they're not living from day to day, as some people do. And you ask them, well, what are you going to do with what you have? And they say, I don't know. I guess I'll just pass it on to someone else. Well, you have a resource that can be used right now for the glory of God. You can make a difference in people's lives. You could certainly make a difference in the life of the church, the Christian community that you belong to. Why not use those gifts that you have in some way to bless others? And then there are elderly people older than me even. And they find themselves perhaps not with a lot of resources in terms of money, but they still have their minds and their hearts, and they still have their hands, and they still have time. And you ask them, what are you going to do with the time you've got? That's a question that we need to each ask one another. What are we going to do with now? Because that is what God has given to us. We can't change the past. We can't control the future. Why not live now, where we are, with God, seeking God's guidance, using God's gifts, blessing God's people, and blessing others for the sake of the kingdom of God. You see, the why questions are important, but they're not as important as the questions of why not? Why not think about the future? Why not use the gifts that you have now to be a blessing to other people? That's what we've got. Accept the gift of now. And someone on Facebook said, that's why they call it the present. Because now is a gift from God. So as you think about today, and as you think about tomorrow, use that gift that God has given to you. Call upon God to guide you and to help you and support you. Surround yourself with Christian loving friends who will encourage you and support you in your struggles and will help you to work through the questions and challenges you have in your life. Because you see, God is with you now. Today is the day of salvation. Now is the day in which we can glorify God with what we have and who we are. That is what the kingdom of God is all about.